As the 20th century dawned, Oak Island stood weathered but unyielding. Dozens of shafts scarred the earth like veins, rusted equipment lay tangled near the shoreline, and the haunting silence of failure blanketed the island like fog. The island had resisted everything: hope, manpower, strategy, and brute force. But it had not been forgotten. In fact, the new century brought something the 19th could not: innovation. While steam pumps and cribbing had failed in the past, the next wave of treasure hunters believed that modern engineering would finally conquer the money pit. The world was changing. Skyscrapers pierced the sky in New York. Ships crossed the Atlantic in record time, and electricity hummed through cities once ruled by candlelight. Why couldn't the same ingenuity finally unlock Oak Island's secret? In the early 1900s, a group led by William Chappell, a contractor with a mind for design and a passion for history, formed a new syndicate and began operations on the island. Chappell wasn't a wild dreamer. He was careful, methodical, and invested in facts. He reviewed every previous expedition's notes and maps and approached the dig with renewed logic. His team didn't immediately return to the original money pit, which was now too unstable to excavate. Instead, they focused on areas nearby, hoping to intercept the elusive treasure vault from a side angle. It was a new tactic, rooted in the theory that the real treasure chamber had been missed entirely due to earlier collapses and water intrusion. Their strategy paid off, at least initially. In 1909, while boring near what was believed to be the original pit location, Chappell's drill struck something hard at around 160 feet. What came up in the core sample stunned the crew: a piece of cement followed by a small iron artifact resembling a hand-forged nail and a fragment of parchment. The writing on the parchment appeared faded but deliberate. A single letter, possibly a V or W. To outsiders, this may have seemed like little more than debris, but to those who had studied Oak Island for years, it was monumental. Cement, iron, and parchment, all in a single sample, buried more than 150 feet underground. It was proof, however faint, of something man-made, something hidden, something intentional. But again, just as excitement began to rise, the island retaliated. Flooding returned, and boreholes collapsed. Despite their best efforts, the team was unable to recover anything else from the same area. The elusive vault had slipped through their fingers once more, yet Chappell's discoveries would leave a lasting impression. So much so that they caught the attention of a young man named Franklin Delano Roosevelt, then just 27 years old, years before he would become President of the United States. Roosevelt was fascinated by Oak Island. The mystery, the history, and the enduring human obsession all captivated him. He became part of a financing syndicate with ties to Chappell's operation and even visited the island personally. Though he never returned, he followed developments on Oak Island for decades afterward, reportedly requesting updates from associates while he was in the White House. The Roosevelt connection was just one example of how Oak Island's legend had begun to stretch beyond Nova Scotia. It had entered the public consciousness in a new way. This wasn't just a local treasure hunt anymore. It was a national fascination. Encouraged by Chappell's partial success, another syndicate formed, the Old Gold Salvage and Wrecking Company. This group, too, included Roosevelt and other investors who pooled funds to resume digging. Their method was more aggressive: larger shafts, heavier machinery, and increased use of steam pumps. But Oak Island held firm. As shafts collapsed and financial losses mounted, even Roosevelt's enthusiasm waned. The 1910s passed with little success. World War I shifted global attention, and Oak Island sat mostly dormant for the next decade. But the 1920s brought new life. A man named William Blair formed yet another company, the Oak Island Treasure Company, and resumed boring near the money pit. Blair believed he could improve upon past failures by incorporating updated drill rigs and concrete reinforcements. His team managed to extract samples similar to those recovered in 1909, traces of cement, small wood shavings, and the ever-elusive fragments of parchment. They pressed deeper. Then a new mystery emerged. At roughly 170 feet, a drill struck a cavity, a hollow space. As the drill bit descended into it, it made several soft contacts. The team believed it had struck chests, possibly multiple, resting in a sealed stone room. Echo tests and pressure readings suggested an open chamber, roughly 6 feet tall, with hard walls and soft materials stacked within. It was the closest anyone had come to confirming the presence of a vault. But what came next was all too familiar. As workers prepared to widen the borehole and lower a retrieval device, disaster struck. Water began to rise from below, not from Smith's Cove, but from deeper underground. It surged into the borehole and caused a total collapse. The chamber was lost again. Some claimed that the chamber had been deliberately flooded, a second trap set to destroy it if tampered with. Others believed it had already decayed naturally, its contents destroyed by centuries underground. Either way, the opportunity was gone. By the end of the 1920s, Oak Island had seen over a dozen separate companies, dozens of shafts, and hundreds of thousands of dollars spent, and not 1 ounce of treasure had been retrieved. Still they came. The 1930s brought with it the era of deep core drilling and seismic analysis. These technologies, though in their infancy, offered new hope. Teams began using sound wave equipment to measure anomalies underground. While the results were inconclusive, many pointed to areas of unnatural density that could indicate chambers, vaults, or metallic contents. Once again, drills were deployed. Once again, the evidence was promising. A cavity here, a strange metal resonance there. But the pit remained sealed in its stubborn silence. Then came the Great Depression. As financial markets crashed and investment dried up across the globe, Oak Island grew quiet. Work slowed to a crawl, and the mystery returned to sleep beneath the earth. The once bustling campgrounds were empty. Machinery rusted in the salt air. The money pit was filled with nothing but silence and memory. But not everyone had given up. The 1930s, a retired naval engineer named Gilbert Hedden visited the island after reading about it in a magazine. Unlike many who came before, Hedden wasn't seeking adventure or fame. He was a man of logic, and what he read fascinated him. He pored over every diagram and journal he could find. Something about the measurements, the artifacts, and the engineering convinced him the island was hiding something real. He bought land on Oak Island, he purchased equipment, he dug. In 1936, Hedden's team uncovered a stone tunnel running east to west, roughly 100 feet inland from Smith's Cove. It was dry, a rarity, and carefully laid with flat stones. Some believed it could be a feeder tunnel or perhaps a transport route for moving items between shafts. Hedden believed he was on the verge of a breakthrough. But just as before, a collapse followed. The tunnel caved in. Secondary shaft filled with water. Hedden, like so many before, ran out of funds before he could finish his work. Yet his legacy lingered. He had brought methodical engineering back to Oak Island. He had reminded the world that there was still more to be found. And perhaps most importantly, he reignited the obsession for a new generation. As the 1940s arrived and war once again consumed the world's attention, Oak Island returned to its natural state, quiet, forested, and undisturbed. But beneath its soil, the legend remained, intact and patient. By 1950, the island had seen half a century of technological advancement and half a century of failure. The tools had changed. The men had changed. The outcome had not. The money pit remained undefeated. The 1930s brought a new wave of ambition to Oak Island. Despite decades of disappointment and financial ruin, the legend of the money pit remained alive in the hearts of dreamers, engineers, and wealthy investors. The belief that the treasure was real, and perhaps closer than ever to being discovered, fueled yet another chapter in this relentless saga. Among the new generation of seekers was a man named Gilbert Hedden, steel industrialist and former superintendent of public works in New Jersey. He first encountered the Oak Island story in a 1928 edition of the New York Times Magazine. The article recounted the history of the island's mysterious shafts, booby-trapped tunnels, and failed excavations. Hedden, a practical and educated man, was immediately intrigued. He immersed himself in research, collecting every document, map, and article he could find. The more he read, the more obsessed he became. Unlike some who had come before him, Hedden had the financial means to take immediate action. In 1934, he purchased a significant portion of Oak Island and assembled a team to begin a new round of exploration. Hedden's approach was unique for the time. He emphasized planning, documentation, and caution. His team used advanced boring techniques, newly available from mining industries, and began investigating areas adjacent to the original money pit. They also conducted one of the first comprehensive surveys of Smith's Cove, suspecting it still held clues about the ingenious flood tunnel system. What they found was compelling. At Smith's Cove, Hedden's workers uncovered a U-shaped wooden structure buried beneath layers of clay and beach gravel. Carefully excavated, it revealed evidence of purposeful construction. Interlocked timbers, layered platforms, and traces of coconut fiber, once again confirming the presence of non-native materials. These discoveries reinforced the theory that Smith's Cove was indeed the source of the flooding system. Engineered to protect whatever lay deep in the money pit, excited by these findings, Hedden hired divers to investigate underwater passages. Their work, though limited by the technology of the time, confirmed the presence of subterranean channels connecting the sea to the island's interior. This added weight to the belief that the island had been engineered with remarkable sophistication. Hedden also conducted drilling operations, focusing on several promising sites near the money pit. While no treasure was recovered, core samples again revealed oak wood, cemental-like material, and soft metal shavings. The story of a hidden vault beneath the island refused to die. Even more curiously, Hedden found what he believed to be a carved stone with strange symbols etched into its surface. Some theorists connected this stone to the infamous inscribed tablet said to have been found by the Truro Company in the 1800s, which had vanished decades earlier. Although its authenticity was never confirmed, it became yet another thread in the growing tapestry of clues. But as with every expedition before his, Hedden's work was met with obstacles. Heavy rains flooded shafts, equipment failed. Funds began to dwindle. Though he had made progress in mapping the island and confirming several earlier discoveries, he was ultimately unable to reach the chamber he believed was real. Still, his efforts were not in vain. He had reignited interest in the mystery and brought new legitimacy to the legend through methodical work and professional documentation. Even as he withdrew from active exploration in 1939, Hedden's influence lingered, and his records would guide future treasure hunters. Not long after Hedden's departure, another figure emerged who would carry the torch forward, a military man and inventor named Frederick Blair. Blair had been involved with Oak Island since the early 20th century, and now, with new momentum from Hedden's discoveries, he sought to resume the search. Blair's theory was rooted in the idea that the original money pit had collapsed, and that the actual vault lay offset, protected by a web of tunnels. In 1939, he proposed a bold solution, using pressure testing and sound analysis to determine the underground layout of the island. Though rudimentary by modern standards, these methods represented a new era of investigation, one that relied more on science than speculation. His team conducted pressure tests using water columns and created seismic profiles by detonating small charges and measuring vibrations. The data suggested the presence of voids and irregularities far below the surface. These may have been natural formations, or they could have been artificial chambers. Blair, however, lacked sufficient funding to follow through with deep excavation. He turned to private backers, but with the world on the brink of World War II, resources were scarce, though he was unable to continue in the field. His notes and survey results would later serve as a foundation for mid-century explorers. Meanwhile, the legend of Oak Island continued to grow in popular culture. Articles appeared in magazines across North America. Radio programs featured the island in dramatic reenactments. Listeners were captivated by the idea of booby-trapped tunnels, ancient codes, and deadly curses guarding lost treasure. Writers seized the narrative. Some claimed the island held the lost manuscripts of William Shakespeare hidden by Francis Bacon. Others suggested that the treasure was a sacred relic, perhaps the Ark of the Covenant or the Holy Grail, protected by the Knights Templar. These ideas, once relegated to fringe speculation, were now discussed openly in publications and town meetings. The line between history and legend blurred further. As the 1940s unfolded and World War II raged overseas, activity on Oak Island came to a near halt. The global conflict redirected manpower, funding, and attention. Yet the island waited, undisturbed, still holding on to its secrets. Some say the wartime silence deepened the mystery. In the absence of new digs or headlines, speculation filled the void. Stories became more dramatic, The curses more elaborate, the treasure more legendary. The lack of progress only amplified the myth. In 1946, once the war had ended, a small crew returned to the island to resume preliminary survey work. Though underfunded and short on resources, they managed to re-expose part of the Smith's Cove structures. More wooden planks were found, showing consistent craftsmanship and intentional design. Despite their enthusiasm, the project soon stalled. As the decade came to a close, Oak Island had experienced 50 more years of effort and innovation. The age of steam had given way to the age of motors and drills. Yet no amount of technology had managed to crack the code. By 1950, the tally stood grim. Over a dozen major excavations, hundreds of workers, tens of thousands of hours, and at least 6 confirmed deaths. No treasure, no vault, no resolution. At what the island lacked in answers, it made up for in something more powerful: endurance. It had become a crucible of human persistence, an arena for the mind and spirit, and a riddle as old as history itself. And still, the pit waited. By the early 1950s, the relentless search for treasure beneath Oak Island had transformed from a scattered romantic pursuit into a full-blown scientific and psychological obsession. The people who now arrived at the island were no longer just thrill-seekers or hopeful dreamers. They were engineers, geologists, surveyors, and former military men, equipped with the best technology of their time and a determination shaped by decades of unresolved mystery. Such man was Edwin Hamilton, a seasoned military engineer with extensive experience in tunneling operations from World War II. Hamilton brought not only technical knowledge, but a reputation for getting results under pressure. In 1950, he arrived on Oak Island with a detailed plan. Believed the earlier digs had failed due to poor mapping and haphazard shaft placements. If the island was going to give up its secrets, it would have to be through methodical precision and modern tools. Hamilton focused on 2 primary goals. 1, to permanently shut off the flood tunnel system. And 2, to isolate and reach the suspected vault chamber. He brought with him equipment for seismic testing, air pressure measurements, and reinforced drilling techniques. The landscape of Oak Island once again began to buzz with the sound of engines and the echo of steel striking stone. His team began by clearing away the debris from previous failed shafts. Dozens of holes marked the island's southern end like a honeycomb sum, long since collapsed, others filled with water or shored up by rotting timber. Hamilton created a new grid system, documenting every known borehole and cross-referencing it with historical diagrams. It was one of the most comprehensive mapping efforts in Oak Island history. He then directed his crew to drill a new series of test shafts around the Money Pit zone. Using precision boreholes and depth gauges, they struck multiple layers of old wood platforms just as previous teams had reported. They also encountered strange anomalies, voids in the earth where nothing should have existed, suggesting either collapsed chambers or long-rotted structures. At approximately 180 feet down, one borehole passed through what felt like soft metal and fibrous material, possibly cloth or paper. Though no definitive artifacts were retrieved, Hamilton's logs noted evidence of man-made objects and probable storage chamber. Unfortunately, as with so many other promising moments in the island's long saga, the borehole began to collapse. Water surged upward, the surrounding soil destabilized, and the drill had to be abandoned. Still, Hamilton remained undeterred. His attention then turned toward Smith's Cove. He believed that the key to solving the flooding issue lay there, one of the most ambitious undertakings to date. His team constructed a large coffer dam around the cove, temporarily pushing back the sea so they could excavate the seabed. What they uncovered added new fuel to the legend. Beneath the silt and seaweed, they found a system of box-drained stone-lined channels shaped in a fan-like formation, carefully engineered to funnel water into an underground tunnel. Alongside these were more layers of coconut fiber, evidence once again of foreign materials brought in for a very specific purpose. It was undeniable. Someone had created a flooding system with extraordinary care and knowledge. But as they continued excavating, a sudden storm battered the coast. High waves breached the coffer dam, flooding the worksite and rendering it too dangerous to continue. Repairs would be too costly, and the project was suspended. Hamilton documented everything. His reports, sketches, and charts became part of the growing archive of Oak Island research. Though he never found the treasure, his work laid a vital foundation for future explorers. In the mid-1950s, yet another major figure entered the Oak Island narrative: Robert Restall, a former circus performer turned mechanical engineer. Restall had read about the island in a magazine and became captivated by its lore. By 1959, he and his family had moved to Oak Island permanently. Unlike previous efforts, the Restall operation was small and family-run. Robert was joined by his wife, Mildred, and their sons Bobby and Richard. They lived on the island, built their own shelters, and worked methodically. Restall was convinced that the key to solving the island's secrets lay not in brute force, but in understanding the logic of its builders. He focused much of his attention on the northern sector of the island, exploring the idea that multiple shafts and decoys had been constructed to mislead treasure seekers. His theory was that a series of tunnels interconnected beneath the surface and could be traced through airflow patterns and subtle ground shifts. Using smoke bombs and air pressure tests, he began mapping what he believed to be a hidden network. Over several seasons, the Restalls unearthed fragments of tools, cut stones, and what appeared to be carved symbols on submerged rocks. Mildred kept meticulous notes, and Bobby recorded much of the work on camera and in journals. Their camp became a modest hub of investigation, combining practicality with passion. However, tragedy struck in 1965 just outside the range of this chapter's historical scope. But the seeds of that event were planted in these years, as the Restalls pushed further into unexplored shafts with limited safety equipment and increasing urgency. Meanwhile, the broader world had not forgotten about Oak Island. By the end of the 1950s, the mystery had reached new heights in public interest. Television specials and magazine features brought the story into living rooms around the world. The island was no longer just a Canadian curiosity. It was an international enigma. With this growing attention came fresh theories. Some now believed the island held not just pirate treasure or lost manuscripts, but evidence of pre-Columbian contact, ancient maps, or even proof of lost civilizations. As the Cold War intensified, and the world sought meaning in conspiracy and hidden knowledge, Oak Island became the perfect cipher for collective curiosity. By the time the 1950s came to a close, the stage was set for a new era. Technology had improved, theories had evolved, and the island had seen more scientific progress in 50 years than in the previous 100, yet the vault, if it existed, remained untouched. Oak Island was no longer just resisting excavation. It was evolving alongside it. And still, the pit waited. As the second half of the 20th century approached, Oak Island had undergone a complete transformation, from a simple wooded landscape to a labyrinth of shafts, tunnels, debris fields, and ghostly remains of failed machinery. It was a place marked not only by its mystery, but by the wear and tear of human ambition. And still, it kept its secret. The story of Oak Island had by now entered a new dimension. It was no longer just about treasure. It was about legacy, about persistence. It's about generations of people who had sacrificed comfort, money, and in some cases, even their lives in the name of an answer that continued to remain just out of reach. Throughout the late 1940s, interest in the island began to revive after the war. Civilian life resumed across North America, and those who had been captivated by Oak Island in earlier years found themselves drawn back to the riddle that remained unsolved. One of the final projects of this era came in the form of a renewed interest in sonar mapping and electrical resistivity testing, technologies that had been used with some success in mineral exploration. These new methods were designed to detect underground cavities and irregularities in soil composition by measuring changes in electric current flow or acoustic echo. A team of amateur geophysicists from Halifax, curious about the theories still surrounding the money pit, arranged to conduct one of the first rudimentary resistivity surveys of the island. Their tests showed intriguing results, anomalies suggesting voids at various depths, especially in the triangle between the money pit, borehole 10X, and Smith's Cove. These findings were far from conclusive, but they gave future treasure hunters a new data set to build upon. Perhaps more importantly, they helped frame the mystery in the language of science, not just folklore or obsession. At the same time, the archive of Oak Island materials continued to grow. Researchers began consolidating decades' worth of maps, notes, reports, and samples. Some local libraries began collecting these documents, While universities occasionally used the Oak Island case study in classes on engineering, hydrology, or critical thinking, the sheer amount of documentation, thousands of pages, was staggering, yet much of it was contradictory. One team's success was another team's failure. One borehole struck wood, another stone. Every time a promising discovery was made, it was immediately followed by a setback, flooding, collapse, or doubt. Amid this chaos, a surprising shift occurred. Oak Island became a story passed down within families. There were now second and even third generation diggers, sons following in the footsteps of fathers, inheriting maps, machinery, and notebooks like sacred relics. In some cases, these descendants came not for treasure, but to preserve the history, to continue a pursuit that had become personal. In this way, Oak Island was no longer a destination. It was a rite of passage. Meanwhile, the outside world was changing rapidly. The Cold War was taking shape, and the thirst for secrets and conspiracies was rising. Oak Island, always a magnet for alternative theories, became a popular subject in fringe literature. Books and essays proposed everything from Roman expeditions to Phoenician mariners. Some suggested ancient Hebrew inscriptions beneath the island. Others claimed the island was a celestial map, aligned to stars. These ideas were often dismissed by mainstream scholars, but they continued to gain traction among the public. And in a mystery that had resisted conventional answers for so long, the unconventional began to seem oddly reasonable. But through all this speculation, one truth remained unshaken. The island had been engineered. No matter who had done it or why, the evidence was undeniable. The box drains, the coconut fiber, the wood platforms, the sealed flood tunnels, all pointed to intentional construction, built with tools and foresight and knowledge. That fact alone was enough to keep the island from fading into obscurity. By 1950, the money pit remained an open question. No one had found the treasure. No one had fully mapped the tunnels. No one had located the supposed vault. But what they had built instead was something just as powerful. A legend. A living, breathing story passed down across centuries. A story kept alive not by gold, but by belief. The engineers of the early 20th century had brought with them iron and fire, pumps and drills, sonar and seismic sensors, and yet Oak Island had outlasted them all. Its silence had become its strongest defense. The age of innovation had not solved the riddle, but it had expanded it. And as the sun set on the first half of the 20th century, a new question rose alongside the old one. What is more valuable, the treasure that may lie buried, or the mystery that refuses to be uncovered? For Oak Island, the answer was the same as always. Still the pit waited.